Okay, let's begin then. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. In our first presentation together, we considered the history of the Church in the 6th century, and particularly how it related to our own Coptic Orthodox Church. I promise that my presentation will not be so long this time. I've learned some lessons. It's still very difficult to present the history of a whole century in a single presentation, but I'll do my best. So let's turn to our subject of today. One thing we'll notice in this century is that the Coptic Orthodox Church and the other non-Chalcedonian churches tended to retreat from an involvement in the wider Orthodox political and ecclesiastical context. And we'll see that it becomes easier to speak of a separate Coptic Orthodox Church history from this period, and we'll consider in this presentation why that was. In this century, we will find internal divisions within the non-Chalcedonian community, the effects of two different invasions, first by the Persians and then by the Islamic forces, and there will be theological controversy both inside and outside the Coptic Orthodox and non-Chalcedonian churches. And finally, we'll consider the attitude within the Coptic Orthodox Church towards the changing culture introduced by the Arabic-speaking invaders. I will say at the beginning that it's necessary to study history in some detail. We should not expect that our study of the faith and the Christian community to which we belong requires only a Sunday school level of basic instruction, when in our professional lives and in our university studies, we expect to be gaining new insight. When we have only a very basic understanding of history, we are forced to adopt a very black and white stereotype that hardly reflects the reality of things. It's rather like the difference between a photo taken on an early mobile phone and one taken on one of the latest phones. There's very little detail in the oldest photos that I have saved on my computer. It's not always easy to make things out. It's easy to be confused or to misunderstand. But in a photo on my most recent phone, everything is clear, and I can zoom in on different points and discover details I had not even noticed at first. Of course, we can get bogged down in details, and we'll try to avoid that in this presentation. But the only way we can have a truthful and helpful understanding of our church is to place it in the reality in which it has existed, and not have the equivalent of a badly pixelated view in which nothing much is clear, and so everything has to be just black or white. This more truthful understanding of our own history is necessary for us to have a better grasp of how we are to live in the present, and so that we can trust God for the future. We begin where we ended our first presentation. The churches of Antioch and Alexandria were in schism from each other. And this was significant because these were the two major communities of Christians who had rejected the Chalcedonian settlement. I just want to say a little bit more about how this schism developed, since it illustrates how the history of the church is complicated by misunderstandings that grow into division and hostility. This was not the only or the first time that such a thing had happened. There was a certain monk, Paul, who had been an assistant to Pope Theodosius of Alexandria, and he was an Egyptian. And when the see of Antioch became vacant, he was consecrated as Patriarch of Antioch by Jacob Baradaeus, the famous traveling bishop that we mentioned in the last presentation. After a while, he began to desire the office of Pope of Alexandria, though the Alexandrians were favoring a certain Athanasius, who was the grandson of the honored Empress Theodora. Patriarch Paul wrote against this Athanasius, and this Athanasius began to agitate against Paul. And the Alexandrians of the Coptic Church found themselves offended not only by Paul of Antioch, but by Jacob Baradaeus, who had consecrated him without gaining the wider support and approval of the non-Chalcedonian community. Now, To make matters worse and more complicated, not only were these two arguing and forming their own parties supporting them, there were other bishops at the same time in Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, Conon and Eugenius, and they were promoting what was known as the tritheist heresy. And this stated that the Trinity was three natures rather than one divine nature. The substance of their heresy is not so relevant. Now, Athanasius, this man who was the favored choice as Pope of Alexandria, was associated with this group of tritheists. And Conon and his followers had a disputation, a public dialogue or debate with Paul of Antioch, but the controversy was left unresolved. And it ended that Paul called those he opposed tritheists, while the supporters of Athanasius came to consider Paul and those with him as Sabellians, one who denied any distinction in the Holy Trinity. So this division, which was already forming, began to take on the color of an anti-heretical crusade on both sides. Now, unfortunately, Paul of Antioch found himself placed under extreme physical and moral pressure to enter into communion with the Chalcedonians, and eventually he submitted after promises that had been made that the Council of Chalcedon would be removed and would no longer be a problem. Of course, such a promise was not fulfilled, and Paul found himself in the difficult position where he had accepted communion with the Chalcedonians and gained nothing from it. He was excommunicated by Jacob Baradaeus and by our Coptic Orthodox Church. And there was great unrest in the monasteries, with some supporting Paul and others rejecting him. And so it became a matter of scandal before the Chalcedonians, where there should have been unity in our community, there was division. Now, after 3 years, Paul was received back into communion by Jacob Baradaeus when he repented of the mistake he'd made. But this made our Coptic Orthodox Church even more angry. And we went on to excommunicate Jacob Baradaeus as well as Paul. And there were so many angry letters being sent backwards and forwards that Jacob came to excommunicate Paul yet again. And he went to Syria to consecrate a new patriarch in his place. Now, the bishops of Syria refused to allow him to do this because they felt it was uncanonical, while the existing patriarch was still alive. And Jacob Baradaeus passed away. And the new patriarch of Alexandria, of our Coptic church, Damian, decided that he would go to Syria and consecrate a new patriarch to replace Paul. But this effort also failed. And so none of this maneuvering helped the relationship between Antioch and Alexandria. And in fact, in our Coptic Orthodox Church at the same time, there were similar difficulties. After the death of the great patriarch and Pope Theodosius, a certain man, Theodore, had been consecrated in secret. And that was never a very good idea, because when he revealed himself as the patriarch, he discovered that the population rejected him because that had nothing to do with his election. Instead, the people wanted a deacon Peter consecrated as patriarch. And when this was done, he immediately excommunicated Paul, who had supported Theodore, his rival. And so we can see that there was this political and personal intrigue, both inside our own church and within the relationship between our church and Antioch. And it was in such a situation, in such a context, that this century, the 7th century, began with schism still remaining. But we can see that, in fact, in the new century, reconciliation became possible. And let's think for a moment, looking at the historical record, how did reconciliation come about when there were such ingrained personal and communitarian hostilities? In AD 605, Anastasius became Patriarch of Alexandria after Damian. Damian had persisted in this schism against Antioch. And in Antioch, there was a different patriarch as well, Athanasius I. And in about AD 615, Anastasius and Athanasius decided to do something about the schism that still existed between them. Athanasius set out for Alexandria with several other bishops, and they met with Anastasius outside the city, since at that time the Patriarch of Alexandria was forbidden to go into Alexandria. The Chalcedonians were in control there. And then they met together for a whole month, and they resolved all of the issues between them, and they produced a statement of faith which covered all of the potential points of disagreement and expressed the certainty that they had the same faith. What especially made this reconciliation possible was the method they employed, which is a useful one for us to use in our own times. In their own words, in their letter, they say this: to remove any disagreement, dispute, or scandal from among us, it has pleased us not to examine the things that have been done or written about the difficulties in the time of the supporters of the late Saint Damian, Pope of Alexandria, and of Blessed Peter, who was Patriarch of Antioch, in case the precious members of Christ fall again into disputes and hardships at the occasion of their discussion and this quarrel of words, and in order that we might remove from our midst the fruit and the root of the division of opinion. And if someone from the heterodox, that normally means the Chalcedonians, says to us, how do you understand the things that were written during the time of the difficulty between the blessed archbishops who came before you? We will make this general response: those who wrote these things have gone to God. And as for us, according to the doctrinal agreement which has now taken place between us, as to the Orthodox faith, we are mutually united. This was an important principle, and it's one that's valuable in every age, and in the discussions and arguments that are taking place inside our own church, even today, and in our discussions with other communities. They were not ignoring the serious matters which needed discussion, but they wanted to begin by discovering what each of them actually believed about God and Christ, rather than simply taking sides with their predecessors. Indeed, the Church of Antioch continued to commemorate the memory of their Patriarch Peter, and the Church of Alexandria, our Coptic Orthodox Church, continued to commemorate the memory of Pope Damian, even though they had been in schism. But unity was restored on the basis of what Anastasius and Athanasius actually believed in common, and not on what it was assumed that their predecessors taught. It's important for us also to begin any discussion, even in our own personal circumstances, with a desire to know what the other person actually believes for themselves, and not simply what they believe about some other person or event. It has a bearing on how we consider the Council of Chalcedon, for instance, even today, and our increasing openness towards the Eastern Orthodox. This is just one example of where something in the detail of our church history can be applied to our own circumstances very fruitfully. The church is always affected and influenced by external factors, and in this period, it was the eruption of the centuries-long warfare with the Persian Empire which was the cause. During the years AD 582 to 602, Maurice had been a successful emperor, and he had pushed back the Persian Empire and almost reached and captured the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. Conflict continued with much success for the Byzantine forces, and eventually Maurice actually fought alongside a loyalist army of Persians to secure Khosrow II on the Persian throne. And in a new spirit of friendship, this Khosrow was adopted by Maurice as his own son, to seal the alliance between the Romans and the Persians, even though they'd been at war for 300 years or more. The empire was in financial problems, and by the end of his reign, the army often mutinied because they had not been paid. And in AD 602, a centurion, Phocas, was proclaimed as emperor in Maurice's place, and he was even crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Kyriakos. He entered Constantinople and captured Maurice and his family, and he executed them. Unfortunately, he lacked the support of the nobility in the empire, and he didn't have the experience or the skills to control the government or the army very effectively. He filled many of the senior positions with his own family, even if they were not competent at all. Now, the Persian king Khosrow II took offense at the murder of his adoptive father, as you might expect, and he also took advantage of the confusion that there existed in the Byzantine Empire, and he launched an attack on the provinces of Syria and Palestine. By this time, Heraclius had replaced Phocas as emperor, and this rapid change of emperors didn't help the situation very much either. Nevertheless, the new emperor was unable to resist the Persians, and he was defeated outside the walls of Antioch. And the Persian armies even came as far as the gates of Constantinople, and the emperor considered abandoning the city altogether and sailing across the Mediterranean to Carthage. Indeed, from about 617 to AD 621, Egypt itself began to be overrun by the Persians, and imperial control was lost. And more devastating still for all Christians in the empire, the relic of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem was captured in AD 614 and taken to Persia. Why does this matter for the history of the Coptic Orthodox Church? It is because the successful invasion of the Persians, with whom the empire had been at war for 400 years, profoundly shook all Christians. And it made it possible to think the unthinkable, that perhaps the Roman Empire would not last forever, and perhaps it was not uniquely protected by God. More than that, the occupation of these provinces for some decades by the Persians gave the Syrians and the Alexandrians some experience of what it would be like to be free from imperial control and imperial persecution, and it introduced some possibility of them beginning to desire a greater autonomy for their own affairs. The Persians invaded Egypt with much bloodshed and violence. Bishop Picentios says in a letter at the time, "Because of our sins, God had abandoned us. He has delivered us to the nations without mercy." But it does appear that once the Persians had gained control, there was a period of peace and normality. It was not in their interest to devastate the economy of Egypt, though it was a serious loss to the Roman Empire, which relied on Egypt for supplies of grain. To a great extent, the Coptic Orthodox community was left to itself more than it had been under the Romans. And it was a matter of having a different political master more than anything else. There are a lot of papyri which have been found in Egypt, dating from this period, and many of them are records of taxes being paid, of Egyptians going to various government officials of the Persians and seeking legal advice or judgments in a particular case. And so generally, the Egyptian people at this time were getting on with life much as they had, though they were paying taxes and rent to different lords, different landlords. This was also the case in Syria, where the church was also able to coexist with the new Persian authorities. Indeed, the church found that it had gained control of many of the church buildings that had been given to the Chalcedonians in previous decades. Things were looking up for them. And we can see the positive effect of the Persian conquest in one incident at this time. The Persians were only in control for a few decades, and the Emperor Heraclius launched a counteroffensive from AD 622 onwards. And although there were some setbacks, he was able to divide the Persians among themselves. And in AD 627, he was at the gates of Ctesiphon and had destroyed the Persian king's palace. King Khosrow II was overthrown, and his successor immediately made peace. And in AD 629, Heraclius triumphantly restored the true cross to Jerusalem. Now, in about AD 628, after his victory, he was in the Syrian city of Edessa, and he attended the liturgy of the non-Chalcedonians there under Metropolitan Isaiah. The emperor was very impressed by the numbers of devout Christians who gathered, and he said that it was not right that so many people should be separated from the church of the empire. But when it came to the time for communion, Isaiah refused him and insisted that if he did not reject the Council of Chalcedon in writing, then he could not receive communion. We can imagine how offended the emperor was, and he threw the non-Chalcedonians out of the cathedral and gave it to the Chalcedonians, though they were small in number. But what would inspire the bishop to stand up to the emperor in such a public manner? It is reasonable to conclude that much of the inspiration was found in the previous 25 years of Persian rule, when the church had been left to itself and had not been persecuted because of Chalcedon. It became possible to understand that the church did not necessarily need to be part of the Roman Empire, that it could exist apart from Roman rule if necessary, and even that the emperor, whatever his personal qualities, was not necessarily the political representative of God as had been assumed. Now, Heraclius went to the city of Mabug in the same region, and he was met there by a party including Patriarch Athanasius of Antioch, who we mentioned a little earlier, and 12 other bishops. And they presented a statement of faith to him, which he accepted as being entirely orthodox. But because he still insisted that they must accept Chalcedon, this opportunity for reconciliation was also unsuccessful. And in his anger, he began a persecution of the church. Now, in AD 629, Heraclius was able to regain control of Egypt, a strategic source of food and materials for the rest of the empire. But the history of the patriarchs does not remember him well, although the account was written after his time. When Heraclius had regained control of Egypt and the other provinces, he appointed governors in each place, and to Egypt he sent Cyrus. It might have seemed that everything would continue as it had done. But the defeat of the Persian Empire, especially in such a comprehensive manner, had long-lasting consequences even in Egypt. As noted previously, a more definite independence of thought was present in the church. It was possible to imagine life apart from Constantinople. But even more significantly, the collapse of the Persian Empire as a political and military force directly enabled the rapid development of the newly united Arab tribes under Muhammad to become an effective and destructive military force. This was still not realized in AD 629, when Cyrus was sent to regain control over the political, social, and religious aspects of Egypt. He was already a bishop, and he was interested in reconciliation between the pro and the anti-Chalcedonians. The history of the patriarchs says of this time, on account of the greatness of the trials and the straits and the affliction which Cyrus brought down upon the Orthodox, in order that they might enter into the Chalcedonian faith, a countless number of them went astray, some of them through persecution, some by bribes and honors, and some by persuasion and deceit, so that even Cyrus, the bishop of Nicaea, and Victor, the bishop of the Fayum, and many others denied the Orthodox faith because they had not obeyed the injunctions of the blessed Father Pope Benjamin and had not hidden themselves as the others did. Now, Maggid Mikhail, a deacon now in the Los Angeles Diocese, in his text From Byzantine to Islamic Egypt, shows us that much of this period just before and after the Islamic invasion was deliberately reinterpreted in later times to show that the period of Byzantine rule had been entirely negative and the Muslim conquest was even something of a blessing. And this also applies to this period when Cyrus, as Chalcedonian patriarch, was the de facto governor as well. It's not entirely clear how much there was a persecution of the church. Certainly there was, and this often involved churches being closed. But it doesn't seem that there was a widespread violent persecution of the church under Cyrus. What we do know of the church at this time was that Patriarch Benjamin was unable to enter Alexandria. And as was the case very often in our church history, he spent his time in the remote monasteries. It also seems that those who opposed the effort at reconciliation by Cyrus often lost control of their church buildings. But it also does seem that the brother of Patriarch Benjamin was tortured and drowned for refusing to reveal his brother's whereabouts. To some extent, Egypt found itself experiencing the same demanding relationship with the empire which had prevailed before the Persian conquest, even if there was not sustained violence against the church. But certainly there was again this experience of difficulties, problems in the church life being able to carry on as it had done under the Persians, so that the reintroduction of Roman rule did appear as something negative compared to the decades of relative peace which were experienced under the Persians. Now, Cyrus himself intended to bring about peace and reconciliation. He had become convinced that the concept of what he called mia energia, one united energy, could resolve the conflict between the pro and non-Chalcedonians, and he intended to test his ideas in Egypt. Now, the non-Chalcedonians, our Coptic Orthodox Church, together with the Syrians and others, insisted that Christ was one incarnate nature after the incarnation, mia physis. By this, they meant that he was one individual and not two individuals, God and a man, since they used the word nature in the sense of a real identity. Our church was saying that the one identity of God the Word had become a man. There was no desire in our understanding to reduce or diminish the reality of his humanity. St. Severus once said, "We do not reject the distinction, but God forbid we flee from division." So we have never failed to distinguish between humanity and divinity. These are different things, but we do not want to allow them to become divided into two. The pro-Chalcedonians, for their part, by this time also accepted that Christ was divine and human, and they had repeatedly agreed with our non-Chalcedonian faith in insisting that Christ was one identity. But they still understood our language of one incarnate nature of the Word as meaning that we were in danger of mixing the humanity and the divinity, or neglecting the reality of the humanity altogether. Now, Cyrus and others at the time hoped that by speaking of one united energy of Christ, they might make it possible for us to accept the language of two natures of the humanity and divinity, in a way that established clearly that these both belonged to the one identity of the Word, who operated in both of them in a unity of action that preserved the distinction. Though our church came later to view this failed attempt in negative terms, we can see even in the history of the patriarchs that a great many bishops and members of the church were convinced by Cyrus's effort. We read, as I just did, a countless number of them went astray, some of them through persecution, some by bribes and honors, and some by persuasion and deceit, so that even Cyrus, the bishop of Nicaea, and Victor, the bishop of the Fayum, and many others denied the Orthodox faith. This might have been the perspective some time after these events, but in the decade before the Muslim invasion, it seemed to many in Egypt that this was not a denial of the faith at all. And considering the actual texts that were written at the time, it does suggest that this mere energism, this one energy idea, which Cyrus promoted, was consistent with our Coptic Orthodox faith and our understanding of the mia physis, the one united nature. The perspective of Cyrus is different to that which has come down in our own tradition. And from his point of view, he says this in a letter: "I notify you that all the clergy of the Theodosian party of this city, of Alexandria," and by this he means the Coptic Orthodox, "together with all the civil and military persons of distinction and many thousands of the people, on the 3rd of June, took part with us in the Holy Catholic Church in the pure holy mysteries." Now we know on what basis this union, just before the Muslim invasion, took place. And we have the 9 Kephalia, or chapters, that Cyrus produced to be the basis of the agreement. It insists that Christ is from two natures rather than in two natures, and that he is one, as the Coptic Orthodox would insist. It does later on insist also that he is in two natures, which are the divinity and the humanity, and it is the one and the same who is both, just as St. Cyril teaches. And then he says that this one and the same Christ worked both the divine and the human by one divine human operation. So he was trying in every way possible to explain his own faith in terms that we would appreciate and might find acceptable. And that seems to have been the case. A great many, including many bishops, did receive this statement of faith as orthodox enough. Certainly he seemed to have gone to the trouble of excluding every Nestorian doctrine, and he had used some of the phrases which were part of our own vocabulary, and he had tried to explain what he meant by in two natures, and that it wasn't a Nestorian view at all. We don't need to go into detail about this theological discussion and controversy. It rumbled on after the Muslim invasion, and the Coptic Orthodox Church rather lost direct contact with the controversy. But the important thing is this: at this moment, whatever the later historical understanding represents, it does seem that there was another possibility for reconciliation based on a Christology which was entirely orthodox and in which the demand that Chalcedon be accepted had been removed. And we see this throughout this period of church history, that there were a great many opportunities where reconciliation almost took place. But it was the Council of Chalcedon itself which usually stood in the way of that actually bearing fruit. In the last years before the Muslim invasion, just to close this idea, Heraclius was still seeking to bring about agreement and reconciliation between the divided Christians in the empire. He did often turn to persecution in one way or another, not usually violent, but he did often place restrictions on the churches in our non-Chalcedonian community. He wasn't someone entirely reliable, but he had been trying to bring about reconciliation throughout his period of being emperor. And there was controversy about this mia energia term, though it was generally acceptable to our Coptic Orthodox Church. We understood that it did not mean only one energy, either divine or a mixture. It meant a unity of energy. Nevertheless, many of the Chalcedonians understood it to mean that there was only one energy, and so they rejected this idea out of hand. And in the midst of this argument, Heraclius, while Egypt was still under Roman control, issued an official document, the Ekthesis, in which he commanded, as if he had the power to prevent discussion, he commanded that no one should speak of either one energy or two energies, but they should be silent about the whole matter. And so he says this: all divine and human energy we ascribe to one and the same incarnate word, and we offer him one worship, who for our sake was voluntarily and truly crucified in the flesh and rose from the dead. This was something entirely orthodox. But he went on to say, following the fathers in everything, and so also in this, we confess one will of our Lord Jesus Christ. This was something new, and this allowed the controversy to continue on and on and on. And in the Eastern Orthodox Chalcedonian community, it was not dealt with finally until 681, when they had another council. We have an understanding of how this idea was viewed from our own perspective as non-Chalcedonians. The great historian Michael the Syrian, writing about this period, says this: that those who opposed this teaching condemned everyone who was not confessing two wills, two actions, two deaths for the Messiah. And so it seemed that our church understood that those who spoke of two wills were necessarily speaking about there being two persons in Christ. But following our understanding of mia physis, one identity, we understood speaking of one will as meaning that there was a unity of the human and divine willing, not that the humanity was lacking a will and was just a biological robot. At the moment when the Islamic invasion was about to change everything, the Coptic and Syrian Orthodox churches in particular were sympathetic to the theological position and language of the emperor, even if Chalcedon remained a stumbling block. There was not such a great distance between the Coptic Orthodox position and that held by Heraclius in the Eastern Empire. And so even at that point, had things developed in a different way, there was a possibility for reconciliation based on this language. But the Muslim invasion, of course, changed everything. In AD 641, the armies of Muhammad pressed into Egypt after unexpected and outstanding success against the much weakened Persians. We can only imagine how history might have developed if the rise of Islam had been during a period of Persian strength. The contemporary historian John of Nikiu, a Coptic writer, gives us a sense of what happened during the invasion and how it affected the lives of Coptic Orthodox Christians. He says of the capture of one town, "And thereupon the Muslims made their entry into Nakius and took possession, and finding no soldiers to offer resistance, they proceeded to put to the sword all whom they found in the streets and in the churches, men, women, and infants, and they showed mercy to no one." John describes how Cyrus, who was still in Egypt at this time, had a significant part to play in trying to negotiate peace with the Muslims after the military resistance proved fruitless. And it's written, "And the Egyptians, who through fear of the Muslims had fled and taken refuge in the city of Alexandria, made the following request to the Patriarch Cyrus: Get the Muslims to promise that we may return to our cities and we will become their subjects. And he negotiated for them according to their requests. And so the Muslims took possession of all the land of Egypt, southern and northern, and trebled their taxes. These Egyptians included all of those Coptic Orthodox who had entered into his communion and everyone else who had gathered for security and safety within the walls of Alexandria. He was now the governor of Egypt, as far as the Romans were concerned, and so he had authority to come to such an agreement. And we can see that the immediate experience of our Coptic Orthodox church community in Egypt was one of much increased taxation after the immediate bloody violence had subsided. At the same time, the Coptic Orthodox commentators on this event understood it in spiritual terms. And John of Nikiu writes this: "All these events and the separation of Egypt and Alexandria during the reign of Heraclius, the emperor of the Chalcedons, fell out as they are recorded in the letters of the great Severus, the Patriarch of Antioch, which he wrote in the reign of the Emperor Anastasius, wherein he prophesied against the Roman Empire in these terms: No son shall sit on his father's throne so long as the belief of the Chalcedonians prevails." And so this was the interpretation that our Coptic Orthodox Church gave to these dreadful and shocking and devastating events which had taken place. After Cyrus had died, not long after the Muslim invasion, Pope Benjamin was able to return to Alexandria. And John Nikiu, the writer, says that Cyrus's chief grief as he died, a very sad, broken man, was due to the Muslims who had refused his request on behalf of the Egyptians. He had not been able to negotiate such a good deal as he had hoped. Now, Pope Benjamin, returning to Alexandria, even though the situation was very desperate, was able to visit the churches again. And it's recorded that he has great respect in the history of the patriarchs. One of the very longest accounts in the history of the patriarchs, if not the longest, is concerned with the ministry and the service of Pope Benjamin. So this was clearly a very important time in the history of our church, and he was clearly a very important person at this very pivotal moment. Quite naturally, the period of rule of Cyrus was presented in a negative light, and the reason for the conquest of Egypt was laid at his feet, even though really the situation was much more complex than that. There were many other reasons why Egypt fell, many of them to do with the wider context of the empire. And everyone said this expulsion of the Romans and the victory of the Muslims is due to the wickedness of the Emperor Heraclius and his persecution of the Orthodox through the Patriarch Cyrus. This was the cause of the ruin of the Romans and the subjection of Egypt by the Muslims. So the blame was put squarely at the feet of Heraclius and Cyrus, although actually, if we consider the history in much more detail, we see that there were many complex reasons why the invasion was so successful. What do we read about the condition of the Coptic Orthodox Christians at this period? John says, "And Amir became stronger every day in every field of his activity," the prince general who had invaded Egypt, "and he exacted the taxes which had been determined upon. But he took none of the property of the churches, and he committed no act of spoliation or plunder, and he preserved them throughout all his days. And he increased the taxes to the extent of 22 batter of gold, till all the people hid themselves owing to the greatness of the tribulation, and could not find the means to pay." So it seems that much as under the Persians, after the initial violent invasion and the apostasy of some, it was in the economic sphere that our Coptic Orthodox Church first felt the consequences of the Muslim occupation. The taxes were so high that people were unable to pay them at all. And these economic effects had spiritual outcomes. We read this: "None could recount the mourning and lamentation which took place in that city," in Alexandria. "They even gave away their children in exchange for the great sums which they had to pay monthly. And they had no one to help them. And God destroyed their hopes and delivered the Christians into the hands of their enemies." Things were so difficult at this period. The taxes were so high that some even gave their children up into slavery to be able to pay what was demanded from them. John is writing as someone who was himself a child in Egypt at this time. And he completes his historical chronicle, which is available in English online, in the period after the invasion. And his final words of his history describe how many were already becoming Muslims in about 690 AD. But he saw this happening throughout his life. And he says this: "Now many of the Egyptians who had been false Christians denied the holy Orthodox faith and the life-giving baptism, and they embraced the religion of the Muslim, the enemies of God, and accepted the detestable doctrine of the beast, that is Muhammad. And they erred together with those idolaters and took arms in their hands and fought against the Christians." It's interesting that John describes Muhammad as the beast from Revelation. And so it's clear that our Coptic Orthodox Church at this time felt that they were living in the last days because something so dreadful had happened. And it seemed to them that the words of Revelation were being fulfilled in their own experience. It was so dire and so shocking. But throughout this period of this century we're considering, it's already clear that many members of the Coptic Orthodox Church, those that John calls false Christians, were abandoning their membership of the church and were becoming Muslim for various reasons of personal benefit. In the time of Pope Benjamin, it appears that he was able to govern the church without interference, and that the Emir even asked him to pray for him, saying this: "You can resume the government of all your churches and of your people and administer their affairs. And if you will pray for me that I may go to the west and to Pentapolis and take possession of them as I have of Egypt and return to you safely and speedily, I will do for you all that you ask of me." So it's clear that Pope Benjamin was able to develop at least a positive and useful relationship with the Emir. It required a certain subservience. It required great care. If you read the account of Pope Benjamin's life, you will see how careful he had to be and how very often he found himself in danger in dealing with the Emir and the Muslims. But we see that there was a good relationship between them. And this was to the benefit of the Coptic Orthodox Church, who found that they were able to administer their church, to administer their community affairs under the guidance of the patriarch. About Benjamin, much is written in the history of the patriarchs, and you can read that. But after him came Agathon. And in his time, we learn that the Muslims had continued to conquer all the way across the Mediterranean. And many Christian captives were brought to Egypt as slaves. And we read this: the holy patriarch Agathon was sad at heart when he saw his fellow Christians in the hands of the Gentiles, in the hands of the Muslims. And as the conquerors had offered many souls of them for sale, he bought them and set them free. This actually became a lasting practice of our church and other Orthodox churches in the Middle East. It was considered to be something commendable and important that Christian slaves should be purchased back. Of course, there was a danger that this could generate a market in Christian slaves. But it was felt that Christians should not be slaves to pagan masters, and to set a Christian soul free from such slavery was considered a good thing. What was significant is that these slaves, if we read the account, were not actually Orthodox. They were not members of the Coptic Orthodox Church or one of the mainstream churches. They were one of the Orthodox sects which were outside of the church. But Agathon still felt that they were Orthodox and Christian enough that it was right and proper that he should use some of the wealth of the church, such as it was at the time, to set these people free. Agathon, we read, also took advantage of the relative freedom he experienced to ordain bishops and priests for the church. And it was probably re-established on a firmer foundation than it had been for many years. Under the Romans, certainly, it had been very difficult to ordain bishops. The governor of Alexandria at the time, though, was a Chalcedonian called Theodore. And it's not so fair to call him a wicked man because of his faith, but he was part of the Roman imperial party, part of the government, perhaps, that remained from the Roman times in Alexandria. And he obtained permission from the emir to tax the Christians, and he demanded funds from the patriarch Agathon. And he issued a command stating that if anyone saw Pope Agathon outside of his house on the streets, they should stone him to death, and they would not be held responsible. And so once again, with such a threat hanging over him, the Pope of Alexandria had to go into hiding. It's very hard to imagine that the imperial officers who were still in Alexandria in this period of Muslim rule would work to produce harm to the Coptic Orthodox community. But when Pope Agathon died in 677, we read this: when the Holy Father Abba Agathon went to his rest, Theodore laid his hand on everything so that they could not even find bread to eat on the day of the patriarch's death, for he put his seal on everything that belonged to Agathon and on all that they had. It seemed that there were real problems caused by these who remained from the Byzantine court in Alexandria, as well as from the new Muslim rulers. Nevertheless, with a change in patriarchs and in governors and in Muslim princes, there was always the possibility for a change in circumstance. Sometimes this was for the good, sometimes this was for the bad. Theodore, the unpleasant governor, was succeeded by his son, and Pope Agathon was succeeded by Pope John III, who the history of the patriarchs call a saint. Of course, we venerate the memory of many of our patriarchs, but there are few who are named as saints in the history of the patriarchs, whose lives were so outstanding that they stood out from the beginning. The history of the patriarchs says about this John, now this father was a saint, and the grace of God appeared in his face as in Moses the prophet, so that no one could look upon his face, nor discern its features, nor the sockets of his eyes, on account of the great light which was upon it. At this time, this saintly John found that all the churches in Alexandria had been sealed closed, at least to the Coptic Orthodox community. There was persecution, again, not from the Muslims this time, but by the remains of the Byzantine government still in Alexandria. And so Pope John wrote to Abd al-Aziz, the new prince governing Egypt, to make known to them, we read, what had been done concerning the seal which had been placed on all the places, and the trouble with the misbelieving Chalcedonians from which he was suffering. And thereupon he sent messages to Alexandria with instructions, this is Abd al-Aziz, with instructions that the seal should be broken in all the places named, and all the property of the church should be delivered to the patriarch. Just as it was scandalous that the non-Christian, non-Chalcedonian community should have been divided among itself at the beginning of this century, so it was desperately sad that in the middle of these grave difficulties, the Chalcedonians, or rather the Roman party in Alexandria, was still determined to make life difficult for the Copts. Nor was this the end of it. On one occasion, Abd al-Aziz traveled to Alexandria from Cairo to collect the taxes that were due. Of course, Cairo was not a city at all at the time of the Muslim invasion, as you know, and it slowly developed as the new Muslim capital of Egypt. And he came to Alexandria to collect the taxes that were due. And he entered the city quietly and privately so that the patriarch was unaware of his entrance. And this Roman party again stirred up trouble. And they told Abd al-Aziz that John was being deliberately disrespectful to him. And Abd al-Aziz was furious and had him called before him, where he demanded that he pay the impossible figure of 100,000 denarii. Over a period of some days, the patriarch kept being called back again and again, and he showed himself willing to endure any torture that was threatened. But he could not and would not pay the money, and he insisted that he only had the clothes which he was wearing to his name. Eventually, the bill was reduced right the way down to 10,000 denarii, and at that point, the leaders of the Coptic Orthodox community insisted that he accept this reduction, and they said that they would find a way to pay it themselves. Thankfully, the Emir, the prince, came to recognize the value of Pope John, and we read this: God, the only worker of miracles, granted to the father, our patriarch, acceptance and favor with the Emir, who commanded throughout the city that no one should address the patriarch except with good words, and no one should say any evil of him, and no one should hinder him in what he desired, neither in going out of the city nor coming into it. So again, we see two aspects here. We see that the Coptic Church suffered from a certain arbitrary violence from the Muslims, not necessarily a violence as it was in the invasion, but you were never quite sure what might happen. You were never quite sure what the governor of Egypt might decide and how he might become offended or grow angry. On the other hand, the patriarchs continued to develop generally good relationships with the leaders of the Muslim government for the sake of the church. And this allowed them generally to govern the church with a greater degree of freedom than they had experienced for some time, certainly from after Chalcedon. Now, after the repose of John, and we're coming to the end of the century, the bishops and leaders gathered together and they intended to secretly consecrate a certain deacon George as patriarch. And they wanted to do it quietly so that the Emir could not interfere. Now, Patriarch John, the saint, had intended that his assistant Isaiah should be the patriarch after him. And when Deacon George and the bishops and the priests went to attend Abd al-Aziz in Cairo, and when George was presented as the candidate for the new patriarch, he became angry because he knew that Isaiah was the choice of John, whom he had respected. And so he cancelled George's nomination and he insisted that the bishops should consecrate Isaiah as John had intended. This interference in the church could be for good, but we know it also could be for evil. A little later, during the patriarchate of Isaiah, we read that this happened. Abd al-Aziz commanded that all the crosses which were in the land of Egypt should be destroyed, even the crosses of gold and silver. And so the Christians in the land of Egypt were troubled. Moreover, he wrote certain inscriptions and placed them on the doors of the churches at Misir and in the Delta, saying in them these words: Muhammad is the great apostle of God, and Jesus also is the apostle of God, but verily God is not begotten and does not beget. So he insisted that this sign be written and placed above all the churches, not only in Cairo as it was being built, but in Alexandria as well. And this must have been a very difficult thing for our Coptic Orthodox mothers and fathers in ancient times to bear. And we also see that he wanted the crosses taken down from the churches. He didn't want the cross to be visible in his time anymore. And this also was a burden for the Christians. Nevertheless, even though there were these difficulties, we read that at the time of the repose of the Patriarch Isaiah, the Church of St. Mark had 140 clergy attached to it, 140. Therefore, we can assume that despite taxation, despite some persecution, despite the imposition of various difficult conditions, and even the apostasy of some people, the church was generally able to conduct itself in the time of Isaiah. And we read of his time: by his means, the liturgies in the churches of the Orthodox, where they could not be performed before, were restored. So even with all of these difficulties, it seems that at the end of Isaiah's time as patriarch, things were not going so bad. The liturgy was being prayed in more places, not less places. And despite some of these difficult and awkward impositions, the requirement to have a sign, the taking down of crosses, generally the life of the church was prospering. It was Pope Simon who carried the Coptic Orthodox community into the 8th century as we come to the end of this presentation. And he succeeded Isaiah in AD 698, and he himself reposed in 701. Pope Agathon, the previous patriarch, had ordained Simon as a priest. And he was in a monastery in Egypt, and he was second in rank in that monastery. But what is significant is that he was a Syrian by birth. And this indicates to us that even at this time in the history of the Coptic Orthodox Church, it was not narrowly focused on ethnicity. It was a local church, and the bishops, priests, and people were those gathered together, especially in Alexandria, but along the Nile. But it wasn't a mono-ethnic culture. It was still a church where all who found themselves in Egypt were members of this church. And so it was possible for the bishops to choose Simon, a Syrian, to become Pope and Patriarch. It was in his time, and we might expect this perhaps, it was in his time, right at the very end of this 7th century, that he sent a letter to Julian, the Patriarch of Antioch, reminding him of the unity between the two sees. This had fallen into disuse through the Muslim invasion. It had been very hard for Alexandria and Syria to have the same contact they'd had before. And so even though they had come back into communion in AD 615, after the Muslim invasion, it had been very hard to have a real connection. And so in the time of Simon, this connection was re-established. He lived a life of great ascesis, so that he ate only a little bread each day to break his fast. He was a very ascetic, monastic man. Unfortunately, this led to some problems, and it's a sad note in some ways that we come to the end of the century, considering the Coptic Orthodox Church. We read that he did not used to associate with the bishops or clergy. He wasn't an extrovert, he was an introvert, we can say. And he loved solitude, and he used to observe the times of prayer. And for this reason, he was hated by the people of Alexandria. This is what we find written in the history of the patriarchs. This is not what someone else outside of Egypt has written. Therefore, some of the clergy went to certain magicians and gave them gold so that they made for them by their magic art a deadly poison, which they put in the cup which the Father Simon the Patriarch used to drink from, and they brought it to him that he might take some of it. Now, those of us who are clergy are used to not being popular with everyone, but we don't expect that the members of our congregation will try and poison us, you know. But this was the situation of the church at the end of this century. Of course, not everyone was the same, but there was a group of people, clergy, gathered around the patriarch who were able to imagine and conceive that it would be proper to poison him. 3 times he was poisoned by some of his own clergy, and each time he was miraculously preserved. And eventually the emir, the prince, saw that he was sick, and discovering that 4 of the priests had tried to murder him, he had them taken and was prepared to burn them to death together with the magician who had made the poison. And we read in the history of the patriarchs that Pope Simon interceded for them, even falling on his face before the emir, and so they were preserved, although unfortunately the magician wasn't, and he was burnt to death. The church was suffering from other problems in these last decades. Coptic Orthodox men began to adopt the Muslim custom of having many wives, or rather unlawful mistresses. Of course, not all of them, but there was a minority who began to have multiple wives, as the Muslims did. And the bishops refused to allow them to have communion. And so they went to the emir and complained, and he became angry with the bishops because he saw no problem with having many wives. On another occasion, when the Emperor Leontius had gained the throne, we read that the emir on that day forbade the Christians to hold any liturgies. And the Muslims said that the Christians were in error, giving God a wife and a son. And the Muslims said that Christians uttered many falsehoods in their religion, and the emir rebuked their lack of agreement in the documents of religion. So even when a new emperor came to the throne in Constantinople, right across the Mediterranean, we still find that the emir uses this as an opportunity to express his power and dominion over the Christians by forbidding them from celebrating their liturgies. So even in such circumstances where generally it was okay for the church, there were these external cultural influences now starting to seep into the community. And there was still the random acts against the church from the emir that could never quite be predicted. It must have been very difficult for the patriarchs throughout this period to walk on such a tightrope. And of Pope Simon the Syrian, we read this in the history of the patriarchs. This holy man Simon was striving all of his life to prevent difficulties between the Christians and the Muslims, so that no one might suffer any loss through him. And through him, the Lord used to show his wonders. Now, outside of Egypt, the Chalcedonian community continued to discuss the consequences of the 1 or 2 wills in Christ. This had rather passed our Coptic Orthodox Church by now. We had other things to worry about. The Coptic Orthodox naturally sided with the sense that Christ had one united will, though we distinguished between the human and divine faculty of willing. But this controversy now moved off into Eastern Orthodoxy and Chalcedonianism. And after the Muslim conquest, even contact with Antioch was lost until the end of this century. Inside Egypt, there were economic consequences due to the Muslim occupation, and these were often severe. The position of the Christian faith as a second-class form of citizenship is expressed by commands to remove all crosses and to post anti-Christian messages over each church, and the imposition of almost impossible fines on the whim of the emir, and the need for the patriarch to be trying to often conciliate the Muslim rulers must have been very stressful. We can see that some members of the church in this century, after the invasion, began to adopt the Muslim custom of having several wives, and the church resisted this, even in the face of anger from the emir, while we learn that others apostatized completely and became Muslims themselves. Even in this most difficult period, we see that the Roman party in Alexandria, as long as it existed, was doing all it could to make things difficult for the Coptic Orthodox and the various patriarchs, closing their churches, encouraging the animosity of Muslims. And this might have been one reason why the Coptic Orthodox histories remember the period of Roman rule so negatively. There was nothing very positive to remember in these decades during and after the invasion. Through the efforts of succeeding patriarchs in this period, let me conclude, any great controversy in the Coptic Orthodox Church was avoided. Bishops and priests were consecrated and ordained to serve the Coptic Orthodox community wherever it was possible and as widely as possible. And it was through their bravery and through their spiritual care that the church, our Coptic Orthodox Church, was brought to the end of the 7th century, even though the new circumstances could hardly have been imagined at the beginning. And so began a period, really, where the Coptic Orthodox Church had to focus on keeping going, keeping everyone together, maintaining the faith as best it could, preserving the bounds of orthodoxy and the bounds of Christian behavior, as the influence of Muslim ideas of morality and social custom slowly began to affect people. At the very end of this century, just as the centuries cross over, we begin to hear things such as the Apocalypse of St. Samuel, which also is translated into English, where he condemns those who are beginning to speak Arabic, and he insists that the Coptic language should be preserved. So at the very end of this century, we see that many of the challenges which then persist into later centuries have already begun. But the church was preserved to a great extent through the wisdom, the bravery, and the pastoral care of the patriarchs I've named, Benjamin, Agathon, Isaiah, John, and Simon, who held everything together, who tried their best to keep the demands of the Emir and the Muslim leadership from impacting on the church. And thanks to God, to a great extent, because of their holiness, because of their spirituality, this was what happened, and the church was able to pass over into the 8th century. Thank you for listening to me. That's all I want to say about that. And I'm happy that I was as short as I hoped to be. Have we got any questions or comments?